once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome back to the program today a Young Voices contributor by the name of Tyler Cochran. Tyler, good to connect up with you once again. For those meeting you for the first time, take a minute here and just tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, for having me on again today. It's always a pleasure to get to talk to you. So, like you said, I'm a contributor with Young Voices, and I'm also a law student at the University of Iowa and a master's student through Houston Christian University, where I'm studying biblical languages. And I write mostly on religion and culture and where that intersects with politics.
And it's so interesting because it's become an issue in this election year. I mean, I know there's always going to be an interesting take, and sometimes people will go to great lengths to smear or otherwise, question the motives of their opponents. But this whole idea that anybody who says, Christ is king is engaging in anti-Semitism, or that's somehow that's a provocative kind of thing to say, that took me by surprise. Talk to me a little bit about how this is being wielded as kind of a political weapon by some.
Yeah, so the conversation around the use of the biblically true phrase, Christ is king, took on sort of a really weird tone at the beginning on Palm Sunday and kind of running through Holy Week into Easter. And essentially, there really seemed to be two kind of almost different conversations that were happening. On the one hand, was people saying that generally this phrase can be used without issue, that if you say it and you're using it as sort of a shout of praise or simply to declare the truthfulness of it, there's no real problem with that. But that some people can use it to either shout down, unbelievers, or wield it as sort of a club against Jews, and they were simply calling that out.
Interesting.
Some people, that even calling it out there, they were saying, "Oh, you're trying to silence us." I believe Candace Owens said that to say it can be used for anti-Semitism shows a contempt for Christianity, and it was almost like the two sides weren't really talking to each other at times. It's like they were attacking things that not necessarily everyone on the other side was saying. Obviously, not everyone who uses it was saying it for anti-Semitic purposes. Some people didn't even know that's maybe why it was trending at first. But I also never really saw anybody saying that you could never say it. It was always anti-Semitic. It was always, at least the people I saw talking about it, it was in the context of, if you're using it in a specific way that obviously demonstrates contempt for unbelievers, that's problematic and in violation of the third commandment.
And that would make sense. Now, I have to say, one of the things that to me really made, for instance, the American Revolution interesting was that I don't think it was the official motto, maybe it was no king but Jesus. Now, that was when they lived under a king, and I can only imagine there were some people who took umbrage at that. But at the same time, as a Christian, I completely, I embrace that idea. That's right. We have no king but Jesus. Is this just an example of how everything that gets politicized turns into a power struggle?
Yeah, I think that you kind of saw that it seemed to be just two different conversations almost happening. And I do think it's, obviously there is some political elements underlying the phrase Christ is king, because in the first century, the idea that Christ was king also indicated that Caesar wasn't. And so there is sort of political undertones to it, but when you wield it purely for political purposes, you kind of twist it, and it can become something that's not necessarily what it was initially intended to mean, and it becomes almost like a political football that's how conservative are you with how many times you're saying it and who you're saying it to. And it's like, obviously, Paul says that God can use biblical truths spoken out of selfish ambition and, further righteous ends through them. But that doesn't mean we should strive to use things incorrectly or to twist God's word just to further our own political aims.
Yeah, that seeking political advantage can take a lot of different forms. Now, I don't know if the people who take offense at the idea that, that Christ is king, I do seem to remember him saying something along the lines of, "My kingdom is not of this world," but that maybe that doesn't soften the blow for them if they're determined to take offense.
Yeah, and I think part of what made this issue in particular so sort of such a powder keg was this. It's sort of happening against the backdrop of conversations about Christian nationalism and Christians split on being whether or not how we should be involved in politics, how much we should be involved, how should we use our faith and the Bible to shape the world around us. And so I think it just really kind of coalesced around this issue in a lot of ways, because that's just been a conversation that's sort of been in the air for the last, few months to a year. So I think this was just kind of a focal point for that larger conversation.
So let's talk about this from the standpoint of a historical fact. Is it safe to say, Christ is king? Can a person say that and be factually accurate from the historical record?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in Romans, Paul gives his perhaps clearest statement on what the gospel is, and it's couched in terms of Jesus having come into power through his death and resurrection. So that is a central tenet of the Bible. And so as Bible believers, obviously the kingship of Christ is a historical reality. And we know eventually that will play out in the world, and that he will, all knees will bow, every tongue will confess. Obviously that hasn't happened yet, but we know that's happening. But we still can confidently say that he has dethroned the powers of this world through his death and resurrection, and that we're still called even now to recognize him as our King and our Lord.
Yeah, as this controversy unfolded, I have to admit, I kind of found myself feeling a little bit defensive, like, wow, what is the deal here? Is this a push, especially trying to link Christian nationalism? Well, these Christians, they're just out there to impose a theocracy on us. And yet, it seems that the Judeo-Christian principles and ethics had a clear influence on those who founded this nation, settled this nation, created all the greatness that is America. It wasn't an official part of our government, but it still was an underlying force that kept people focused on productive things rather than just simply, chasing hedonistic pleasures.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand that sentiment. When the conversation, was first starting, it's easy to, when people are critiquing the use of that phrase, to sort of be defensive at first. But as I was following it, it did seem like most of these critiques were coming from a good place. And certainly, again, to reiterate, I never saw anybody saying you can never say it, or always saying Christ is king is always anti-Semitic. That I'm sure maybe somebody said that, but in terms of sort of the main conversation was happening, that was never happening. And so
I have to ask you this then, Tyler, in light of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that was passed last week by Congress, I've seen claims, and this is from congressmen that are making this claims. Well, under this, you couldn't say that Jesus was killed by the Jews without running afoul of this piece of legislation. I'd love to get your thought on that piece of legislation. Was it necessary in the first place, or is it just throwing more fuel on the fire?
Yeah, from what I've read about that piece of legislation, it definitely seems like, it comes maybe from a good place of obviously the things that have been happening on college campuses recently, and just conversations in the aftermath of October 7th more broadly. But, sometimes the best thing government can do is take a step back and, just enforce the laws that are already there. In a lot of instances, especially with, again, the stuff that's happening on college campuses, there are already laws on the books that can be enforced when those things go too far. But one of the beauties of free speech is that people get to say what they want, but that also means sometimes we have to sort of withstand things that we'd rather people not say. And so I definitely think it probably goes too far. But I understand sort of what they were wanting to do with it, even if I don't think it was probably the right decision at this time.
Wow. Well, I think you handle, you take what could be a pretty volatile topic and you make a lot of sense out of it. And I applaud you for doing that. And for those who want to follow your work, those who'd like to connect up with you on social media, what's the best place to find your writing, and where can they find you on social media?
Yeah. So the best place you can find me is on Twitter at Tyler Cochran 54. I post all my articles and my interviews there. So if you like this article or you've read some of my articles in the past, they'll be up there, and this interview will go up later, I'm sure, as well. So
okay. Tyler, thank you again. This is, I wish there were more conversations like this taking place, because frankly, it feels like politics is reaching kind of a critical mass, and this seems like a much more rational way to approach it. So thanks for your hard work.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about it with you. It's great to see that people are interested in this kind of thing.
All right. We'll talk again soon. Thanks again. And we are back. Welcome to segment 2 of today's Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Daniel Elmore back to the program. He's a Young Voices contributor. And Daniel, if you would take a moment for the sake of those who are meeting you for the first time, tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, hi, I'm Daniel Elmore, and I'm a senior at Lenore University in North Carolina. I primarily write about economics and consumer choice, and I have a recent article out at the Washington Examiner on student loan forgiveness. Boy,
there's a timely topic, right? I know there are people. Somebody posted something I saw on X or Twitter yesterday about, I can't believe it. You know, my debt is gone. You know, I feel so free. And someone else said, yeah, but ask the taxpayers how they feel, since they're the ones who'll be going ahead and paying that off. Talk to me a little bit about you mentioned in your article the sign, transfer, free room and board. What's the story behind that sign and the lesson learned?
Yeah, so right off of Lenore's campus, there's a sign at a competing university saying transfer, free room and board if you transfer and you're at Lenore for a 4-year university. And it's right there near the interstate for students who are commuting daily. So I thought that was very interesting. And while I've never been tempted by the sign, I thought that it was very interesting, their strategic placement of the sign, and it shows how the free market can be used in higher education.
Well, I imagine the idea of, tuition forgiveness, or I think, what did you refer to as tuition reset, in the article? That's got to be very attractive for students who are like, man, those loans, they don't just go away. It's not the kind of debt that can, you can't declare it, in bankruptcy and have it wiped out. So that's got to feel pretty attractive. But there's a downside when government grants favors like this. What is that downside?
Well, the downside comes in the fact that at some point, someone has to pay for whoever's paying off these loans. So, and that's going to end up being the taxpayer, which may as well end up being the person who took out the loans in the first place if they increase tax rates. Regarding the tuition reset, that's something that my university did. It's a private university. And what happened was that basically they said, okay, we're going to cut your tuition from about $45,000 a year to $30,000 a year, but we're also going to cut your scholarships. Oh. And what ended up happening is that a lot of people ended up paying more than they would have originally. So that was where the transfer, free room and board sign came into play.
Okay. Now, I'm a simple guy, so I have to think about this in simple terms. But if the government were to stay out of the way and allow the market to dictate, tuition costs and so forth, as well as, the issuance of student loans, who's a good credit risk versus who isn't, it seems like this problem wouldn't be nearly as big a problem. What are your thoughts?
Yes, you're absolutely correct on that. However, there's also multiple ways that the government interferes in higher education, not just through student loans. One prominent example is the accreditation system. And if you don't have an accredited system, no one's going to come to your university. So that's another way that they do it. There's multiple other ways, such as FAFSA and other ways.
Having had more than a few kids head off to college, we're quite familiar with the whole FAFSA process. and it's on the one hand, it's like, oh, look at all the aid that's available out there. And on the other hand, it's pretty discouraging when you find out that even though it would be very helpful, because it's a struggle, for us, like most people, but boy, we make too much money. We're just too darn rich, to qualify for a lot of that FAFSA. Darn it. Strange how that works out.
Yeah, it ends up to being to where a lot of the government assistance comes to where it hurts middle class families the most, where sure, you may not be lower class, but you don't have the expendable money, especially in this economy, to give to your kids to pay off for college.
So I try to ascribe noble intentions to what people are doing, even politicians, but this, coming from the Biden White House, especially where I think that maybe they are feeling some pressure, notwithstanding everything that's been thrown at Donald Trump, it seems like he's actually getting more election mojo the more they throw at him. And this seems to me like kind of a calculated move. Well, maybe we can buy some votes from the younger generation if we forgive their student debt. Is it callous? Is that cynical to see it as a ploy to buy votes, or is there some truth to that?
No, you're absolutely correct. There is a political part of this, and there's an economic part, but the problem is that politics is often, or the consequences are only considered in the short run, and that's usually only up to the next election. However, the economic consequences are going to come 5, 10, 15 years down the road, but by that point, people will have forgotten about it and not attribute it to the Biden White House.
And there's a phrase that you use in your article too that I wish more people were familiar with, and that is moral hazard. When we enact bad policies, or we just keep perpetuating bad policies, a moral hazard is created. What exactly is that?
So, put simply, a moral hazard is when people take a lot more risky behavior because they're shielded from the responsibilities that might come with it. This is extremely prominent in insurance, where people may be more likely to go for snowboarding or extreme sports and get hurt if they have insurance and they know they won't be the ones who end up paying for it.
Yeah, well, and I think of it in terms of like, people who become, addicted to, narcotics or whatever, knowing full well, there's a whole welfare system that will take care of me as far as giving me shelter and even medical care if I happen to overdose or whatever. And in other words, the consequences of their choices really aren't theirs, because there's a safety net that shields them from assuming that responsibility. And I assume this could also be applied to, taking out loans, knowing full well I probably won't have to pay them back.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. Moral hazard is not just insurance or medical problems. It's everywhere. And what we see is that because of this moral hazard, the cost of college or whatever it is has to increase at some point to pay for these moral hazards.
And you refer to especially the student loan forgiveness as a bandaid, which I think is a great analogy. Does a bandaid cure whatever is underneath it? No, it just covers it up, right?
Exactly. If you break your leg, it's not like a bandaid's going to fix it. The problem is it's only going to make the problem worse over time, because you're not actually fixing the root problem.
So what's a good place to start when it comes to fixing the root problem with, the rising costs in education? I'd love to get your take on that.
Regarding that, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet that will take care of it. A lot of it is the problem of how much government is involved in education. If you got government at least partly out of education, you would see this startup cost to come down. This is true in basically every single industry that government is involved in. We see that in healthcare as well.
Yeah, but getting government out of these kind of situations, I mean, they've been there for a while, and frankly, I think there are some people, particularly politicians, who really believe their press releases, hey, you need us, in order for this to happen. Now, you bring up something, though, that seems to solve a lot of problems, and I know it's kind of a cuss word to some people, but that word is competition. How would competition help to alleviate some of these woes?
Well, right now what we see, and I talked about the accreditation system earlier, is that you only have state universities competing sometimes with these private universities that are heavily federally funded. And what you see is that you basically have no competition within the university system. So if you open that up, that means new students will have the option to choose between these universities, and it's not just these pseudo private universities versus the public universities. You have actual private universities coming into play.
Well, I would love to see, school choice not just happen at the, K through 12 level, but maybe it's time for the market to be a little bit more involved and the government a little less involved at the collegiate and university level to help alleviate some of these things. Do you feel more optimistic than not? Is this a problem that's likely to lead to a solution, or for the time being, is this going to be a place for politicians to make some promises and hopefully win some votes?
Unfortunately, what we see is that the incentives are just not aligned for politicians to make it cheaper for people to go to university. They want to have them on the government dollars for as long as possible.
Okay, we're talking with Daniel Elmore. Daniel, where is the best place for people to connect with you on social media and to find your writing?
Sure. I'm mostly on X, which is formerly Twitter. That is at Daniel_J_Elmore.
Very good. Great to visit with you. Thank you so much for your hard work.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Ezra Wyrick back to the program. Ezra, good to connect up with you today.
Thanks for having me back on, Brian.
For those people who are meeting you for the first time, take a second, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi there. My name is Ezra Wyrick. I'm the head of youth outreach for the Tennessee Liberty Whip. I'm also a project management consultant with Liberty Seeds, and I'm a Young Voices contributor as well.
All right. You've got a great article here in Reason for about RFK Jr.'s home loan scheme. And, I have to admit, I'm kind of wearied of the whole student loan forgiveness stuff. In fact, we were just talking about this in the last segment with another Young Voices contributor. I had not heard about Kennedy's plan for government-backed mortgage bonds. Can you walk me through when did he start proposing this and what exactly would this entail?
Well, he started proposing it last year. And one of the things that I actually like about RFK as opposed to the rest of the field is that he seemingly has a desire to call attention to problems. The thing I don't like about him is that he doesn't put a lot of effort into really understanding them. And, I think that's demonstrated more than ever by his housing plan. Essentially, what RFK wants to do is start a government-backed home loans project. And for anybody that's paying off student loans, that should be pretty ominous. So he wants the federal government to offer housing bonds to young people trying to buy a house, people that don't really have the funds to buy a house. He has a quote that he made at a town hall where he said, if you have a rich uncle who co-signed your mortgage, you'll get a lower interest rate because the bank looks at his credit rating. And then he said, I'm going to give everyone a rich uncle, and his name is Uncle Sam.
Boy. Oh, boy.
Brian, I don't know about you, but I would not want to buy a house with the federal government's credit rating.
Yeah, that's the federal government partners with me in too many ways that I don't want already, but that would, wow. And I have to ask you this. When student loans, when the government started making it easier for people to get student loans, did we not see the cost of tuition steadily go upward? And why wouldn't the same thing happen, if it's government money or government-backed, loans here? Why wouldn't those selling homes just simply jack the prices up because, hey, Uncle's got a good credit rating, right?
Exactly. And that's kind of the point I made in the article that I wrote for Reason. It's basically that, student loan debts ballooned, but, so did tuition rates. And I believe I put a stat in there. The Congressional Budget Office reported that I believe between 1995 and 2017, federal student loan debt grew from about somewhere in the ballpark of $200 billion to $1.4 trillion.
Wow.
Which is massive. And that's because these colleges kept raising tuition and they knew that the students could just borrow to cover it. So it was an issue of easy loans.
Well, and it also raises an interesting question of, okay, somebody defaults on those loans. Does that mean the government now is the owner? This seems like it would transfer a lot of property ownership into the hands of the political class.
And it seems like we might get into a situation like we're in with federal student loans where there's forgiveness programs that have to start popping up because people are defaulting on their loans. And imagine your house being involved in that as opposed to your education.
Well, there's no doubt there is a crisis in terms of affordable homes. People who locked in their homes, a few years ago are probably saying prayers of gratitude every minute for the fact that they're not shopping for a home today. But with interest rates and home prices, ever higher, what are some of the ways that we could realistically, solve some of the problems? Is there that much of a shortage in the supply of homes right now? Is demand that high?
Oh yeah, there's definitely a huge shortage in supply, and America's housing crisis is very real, and that's why I say it's good that he's calling attention to it. I think a solution would be disastrous. It's real, and it's getting worse. So home prices have skyrocketed by an average of about I believe 30% over the past several years, and in 2023, I believe I included this in the article, home sales were lower than they'd been in almost 30 years. That's 28 years to be exact.
Wow.
Only 53% of non-homeowners think that they can even buy a home. And 12% said the possibility of buying a home is hopeless. So yeah, there is a huge housing crisis. But the solution, and this is a solution that's been proposed by Republicans, been proposed by Democrats, now being proposed as independent. They say, all we need to do is subsidize demand. Well, they're missing the point. It's not a demand issue. It's a supply issue. Construction of multifamily housing units has declined by 1/3 since, I believe, 1987. And the ones that were built in 2021, this is the latest statistics we have, only 5.4% were for sale as condominiums, rather than rental apartments. So it's a scarcity, and that scarcity drives the prices up, creates a market where, modest homes are out of reach for a lot of people. And not just that, in urban areas in particular, this is a problem. You have onerous government regulations like single-family zoning, which if it's a rural area, I can kind of get, but for an urban area, there's not really an excuse. Height restrictions, permitting delays make it very difficult to build more housing. And let me just say, building more housing is the key to solving the crisis. If you increase the supply, then you're going to see prices decline. And one of the reasons, I think an important point to make here is one of the reasons that these kind of rules and regulations persist is because local politicians they're afraid to upset the residents who have a backwards idea of how the housing market works, and they believe that new developments will actually raise their housing costs. But research shows that's not true. That's misguided, and in reality, actually, those kind of developments reduce the cost of housing.
I could also see, and I've seen this sometimes among people who are homeowners, and they're like, well, I want to protect the equity that I have in my home. And that's why, it's important that we zone the heck out of this and make sure only single family dwellings can be built, if that. And it just seems like there's so much regulatory influence that it really throttles, the market forces of supply and demand, which could be working to actually provide solutions.
Oh, yeah, it absolutely does. And it just kind of gets back to basic economics, right? Like basic economics class. When supply is low, prices are going to go up, especially if demand is so high as it is right now. And to lower the prices, we should just build more. We should increase the supply. That is the solution. You don't go out starting government bond programs, like RFK is proposing. You can just build more housing, loosen regulation in urban areas, build more non-single family houses, get rid of some of the zoning restrictions, and then you'll see the prices plummet.
And it sounds like what you're describing is a problem that is probably best solved at the local level. Maybe there's some, state level input that could be required, but I'm having a hard time reconciling the idea that the federal government should have any involvement in it whatsoever.
Yeah, the federal government should stay out of it, essentially. It should be solved at the local level. The issue that we run into is, again, it's mostly local politicians that prop up these laws, and it doesn't matter how much research you put in front of their face that shows how harmful they are. They're going to continue to do it because they're going to continue to pacify their residents.
Wow. Well, my wife and I we're in the position right now where we moved to Idaho, which was just insanely in demand in terms of real estate 3 years ago, and it's still pretty high demand. Home prices are still to the moon. Even rentals are very, very difficult to find. And my wife despairs. We're never going to get into a home again. And I just keep telling her we have to just wait. There will come a time where some equilibrium will return, but sometimes when I see politicians, I'm going to help you. That's when I really get nervous because I'm like, oh, don't just Let it be, and I think it'll sort itself out. But I don't think we need more government help at this point.
Yeah, and that's the reaction you should have whenever the government says it's going to help you, especially when it comes to your house or something that's very important to you. Yeah, that's absolutely the mentality that you should have.
So again, the need is to build more homes. What's the biggest thing that's holding that up? Is it the local politicians that are holding up the ability to build more homes at this point?
Well, it's single family zoning in urban areas for the most part. It's height restrictions, obviously, because if you can't build out, the obvious choice would be to build up. But the problem is, in a lot of these urban areas, you can't build up because there are height restrictions, and there's a lot of nonsense related to, what if airplanes can't see in the fog? And we have ways to prevent that. We live in the 21st century, so you can't really drive home that argument. But one of the biggest problems we have is permitting delays. If you want to build non-single family houses, you have to get a permit in most of these urban areas, and these things can be held up for months or even years if you want to have a big development.
I know this is just anecdotal, but a friend of mine in California was talking about what it took just to do an addition on their house. And I was stunned at the number of permits that were required, permission required. I mean, there was probably 24 different individuals whose hands they had to grease with money and get their permission and their signature just to put a simple addition on their own property. I imagine it's much more complicated once you start to, building new dwellings. Well, Ezra,
I live in the state of...
go ahead.
Yes. I said I live in the state of Tennessee where NIMBYism is really prevalent, and you would be shocked to see how many hands it has to go through for you to be able to build an addition, even a deck on your own.
I got to stop here because we're up against the clock. Ezra, where can people find you on social media?
You can follow me on Twitter at Ezra for Liberty. Thank you so much for having me on.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, this is our fourth and final segment today. We are happy to welcome back to the show a contributor by the name of Donald Kimball. He is the communications manager for the Washington Policy Center. And Donald, I'm sure there are other hats you wear as well. Tell us just a little bit about yourself for those meeting you for the first time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back on. I, like you mentioned, work for the Washington Policy Center. We're a nonprofit free market think tank based in Washington State. Been with them for a long time, and they're fantastic. I'm also a contributor for Young Voices, which has been a great partnership, and America's Future as well, a recent partnership I've been in with.
And I'm very grateful that you are paying close attention to issues like net neutrality. Now, this briefly crossed my radar screen last month, toward the end of April. I know that there was a vote being taken on net neutrality, but I'll admit I don't understand the issue well, so I kind of let it go right over my head. What was the outcome of that vote, and what is the end result of what's taking place right now in Washington, D.C. regarding net neutrality?
Yeah, so back in 2015, there was an initial vote called the Open Internet Order. And what this was a reclassification of broadband providers, so internet service providers, being under the common carrier title. So Title II is the technical term for that. That means that internet carriers were now lumped in with like phone lines and phone companies, where all traffic had to be treated equally. That's the concept of net neutrality, that sort of thing. And so that the FCC gets more control. So that happened from 2015 through the early 2017, and then that was revoked and repealed. So that, a lot of people have heard of net neutrality, particularly because of people like John Oliver and a lot of mainstream people who were talking about the world was going to end without net neutrality. And then that got repealed in 2017. So since 2017 and before 2015, we have been net neutrality free, and internet service providers and broadband networks have been under Title I classification. So now, as of a couple days ago, they took a vote and reauthorized Title II classification of broadband service providers. And so one of those provisions in all of the regulatory framework is this concept of net neutrality. Again, just to summarize sort of the steelman argument for net neutrality is that an internet service provider cannot treat anyone's traffic differently. So they're not able to censor or stifle or slow down or speed up based on the customer. They're merely treating it as equal, like in the same way that a phone provider couldn't say, I don't like what Donnie is saying to Brian on the phone. therefore we're going to censor that. So that's kind of the best case argument for it. But in reality, we actually see a lot of negative consequences with net neutrality.
And I have to ask, was there a big issue pre-net neutrality and post-2017 with those problems? Was that really, the issue that they were saying it might be?
Well, you're getting right to the root of the issue, which is that all of the hypothetical complaints don't materialize when you look at the data. So it's all about, oh, the ISPs could do this, or that they could do that, or this will happen once we do this. And so when you look at the years of net neutrality, again, 2015 through very early 2017, you that kind of is the one snippet of time we can see where these rules and regulatory frameworks were actively enforced, and then before and after. Before and after net neutrality, you did not see this kinds of censorship. In fact, the kinds of censorship we did see was the government coming in and partnering with groups like Twitter and Facebook and saying, whether or not it was outright direct, the government saying censor that person, or putting a lot of pressure to change their rules in order to censor these kinds of posts. That's the actual kinds of censorship we saw. We've not seen any real slowdowns. They will constantly point to an example of California firefighters, their data being throttled. It's actually a misnomer. That was a mobile data plan that would not have been affected by net neutrality. The moment Verizon saw that they were getting throttled, they undid that, and it was all because of the package, a plan that they had purchased where they got a certain amount of high speed and then throttled. So, the examples they point to don't actually work or are hypothetical, and the real world examples have to do with more government intervention, generally speaking.
So this begs the question to me of, cui bono? Who benefits from having this net neutrality regulation in place?
Yeah, the FCC does mostly because they get a lot bigger of regulatory control, a lot more ability to stick their hands in way, tip the scales. And, it's one of those things where a lot of people had made these dire predictions. They said all these bad things were going to happen. And then you can kind of systematically go through and say, no, this didn't happen, that didn't happen. And if that was it, if it was just sort of a defensive argument, that would be one thing. But now that we have sort of years, again, pre, post, and during net neutrality, you can look at the data and see that there are actually some real negative downsides to this kind of framework. So for instance, one of the interesting things is that net neutrality proponents claimed that without net neutrality, you're just going to see all these profits go to the top. You're going to see the companies not investing into networks to expand digital access and all these kinds of things. But the only years where we saw a decrease or maybe a rate of non-increase in investment were either during recessionary years, which is normal for the whole economy, or during the net neutrality years. Every other year when you didn't have net neutrality, you saw investment into the infrastructure and the networks go up. During the net neutrality years, you saw them go down or stabilize and not increase. Another thing is they will talk about wanting to bridge the digital divide, let more Americans have access to high-speed internet. But prices dropped during non-net neutrality years and did not keep dropping during net neutrality years. And access expanded during non-net neutrality years and did not during net neutrality years. So the data we look at shows that the very ends that they say they want to achieve happen better and more effectively when net neutrality is not in effect. There are also some other problems with innovation stifling and things like that, which we can go into. It's a little bit more technical, but when you have this kind of regulatory framework and you have the FCC very heavy-handed saying you can't divide speeds up, you can't treat people differently, this does have a chilling effect on potential innovations that let more people get efficient use out of internet and different bandwidths and things like that from the different networks.
Let's take a moment. Let's talk about those innovations. Now, again, I'm not technically savvy, but I'm very impressed with what's happened so far in terms of, man, it's getting easier by the day, it seems like, to access information pretty much anywhere you can get a cell signal. What are some of the innovations that maybe we should be keeping an eye on?
Well, yeah, the big one that sort of net neutrality could hypothetically threaten is this example of network slicing. This idea is that a 5G bandwidth signal has different bands. And so you can optimize different bands for different kinds of devices that use them. So for instance, if you were to have heavy equipment like construction equipment that needed internet access to read data or react, it would need very low latency. It would need to be able to react very quickly to things. but it wouldn't need a lot of range, as in it wouldn't need to, be able to move far because the big heavy equipment is pretty stationary most of the time. So that's one kind of signal you can send through a 5G band. Whereas a bulk data transfer, if you're backing up, massive amounts of data, that doesn't need low latency because it's just transferring one to the other. It doesn't need to have a quick response time, but it does need high bandwidth. It needs to have a lot of room for all the data to move across. And so when you're able to take advantage of these different bands, you're by definition treating network traffic differently. And so there are exceptions that they've asked to be made for things like network slicing, because that is a technology we use pretty frequently now. But the point of that is that, had we continued to have Title II control and net neutrality in place, the innovation may not have even wanted to be put in the first place, right? Because you might be scared that wouldn't be allowed. So there are technologies that we don't even know that we will be using tomorrow that could be stifled by this kind of regulatory framework. That's
a great explanation. Thank you. And your passion for this topic comes through loud and clear. There's been a common theme pretty much to every segment of today's Moving Forward with Young Voices show. And at least to me, the common thread here is, we've had contributors like you, each describing different issues and different problems in need of a solution. And it seems like every one of them, if government would step back and allow the market to work as it's supposed to, it would be a lot easier for those solutions to come forward.
Well, absolutely. And the last example I want to bring really briefly, because I think this is the nail in the coffin, is people will talk about how essential the internet is, and that's why we need to secure it. That's one of the justifications for this new order. You look at Europe, which has net neutrality styled regulations, and the United States, which did not. And during the most demanding time, when the internet was under the most pressure during COVID, the United States did fine. We had plenty of access. More people were online there than ever before. In Europe, they had to ask Netflix and YouTube to throttle their data because it was being rationed out, because their networks could not support it. So if you actually think the internet is an essential service like they claim, you do not want to move towards net neutrality, because under high duress, non-net neutrality networks hold together and provide where Europe failed pretty miserably during the COVID years.
Funny stuff. Once you look at the data, you can extrapolate some pretty interesting conclusions from there. We are up against the clock here, Donald, so I'm just going to ask you this. Where can people follow you on social media? Where can they find your work?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. You can follow me on X or Twitter at Kimball Donald, or find all of my work at kimbaldonald.com.
All right. And thank you for shining some light on an issue which, again, for me, this is not a well-understood issue, but it definitely directly affects my life. So I appreciate all the clarity you've provided today.